It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC 24G2 or 24G2U depending on your region. The OSD is controlled by pressable buttons on the underside of the bottom bezel towards the right side. You can see there are some faint engraved labels for the button functions there, but they're not really clear, and if you're in a dark room you can't see them at all. There's a little pinprick style, or actually it's a very small triangle style power LED, and that glows a gentle white when the monitor is on and amber when the monitor enters a low power state, so signal to the computer is lost. If you press the first button along, it actually has a little icon there which is source select. If you press that, it allows you to select the source, so it does exactly what you might expect. If you press the left arrow there, which is the next button along, the second button, it allows you to cycle through the game modes, and I'll show you them in the main menu system shortly. The third one along, that activates the little crosshair, the aim point crosshair in the middle of the screen. I'll just change the wallpaper so it's a little bit clearer. There's only one design, you can't cycle different designs, you just enable or disable the aim point crosshair there. The fourth button along is the main menu system, and the fifth button along is the power button. If you go onto the main menu system, you can see that it's laid out in AOC's usual widescreen style. This is a style they've had since, I think it's 2011, so it does have a bit of a dated look, to be honest, and it isn't very intuitive to control it. You don't use a joystick or anything like that for control, and some users find it a little bit confusing. So I'll just quickly run through how you actually control it, because this is something I take for granted. I've used this for a very long time, this kind of menu system. But if you remember, the second and third button actually has a left arrow for the second button and a right arrow for the third button along. And that's how you cycle through the different pages of the menu system. If you press the fourth button, which is the little menu icon, that acts as enter, and that will actually go down a level in the menu, or it'll get you into the specific section of the menu you want to get to. And then you use the left and right arrows to navigate through the different options. And then again, the menu button there, the fourth button along, is your enter button. So that's how you'd select a specific option. The first button there, which was source select before you were actually in the menu system, that acts as your back button or exit. If you press it enough, that's how you go back, and you can select a different option or go to a different part of the menu system. Or you can press it a few times and just exit completely. So hopefully that makes sense. The user manual does actually explain this and shows you if you need a reminder of this. So first up, there's the luminance section. This allows you to change things like the contrast, the brightness. There's something called eco mode, and what this does is it just changes the brightness to a preset value. So there's various different options. There's text, internet, game, movie, sports. There's also reading. This actually makes things completely monochrome, as you can probably see. So that's a little bit of a different mode. Next, there's gamma. There are three different gamma modes you can select: gamma 1, gamma 2, and gamma 3. DCR, dynamic contrast ratio, the dynamic contrast function of the monitor, that's explored in the review. HDR effect. Now, I'm not going to spend too long going through this. Don't get too excited by the term HDR. It doesn't use an HDR signal. All this is it's a weird little filter. So there are a few different settings there. There's HDR picture, HDR movie, and HDR game. And picture, movie, and game, the differences between them, or the main difference, is that there's a sharpness filter applied. Picture has the weakest sharpness filter. Movie has a stronger sharpness filter, and game has an even stronger sharpness filter. So I'm on the picture setting now. And what this does is it greatly oversaturates the image. This monitor has a wide colour gamut. It doesn't need any help with saturation for the image. And what this does is it applies a digital saturation enhancement, so it increases saturation further, but it doesn't increase the gamut itself. It just pulls things close to the edge of the gamut. And what that means is it completely crushes your shade variety. So you get a lower variety of shades. The Origin logo there, for example, it should be more than one flat shade of orange, whereas with this setting enabled, it loses a lot of its variety of orange shades and it just appears quite flat. That's just one example, but things just look clearly oversaturated. The gamma's all messed up as well. It doesn't really look HDR at all. I mean, it's not doing anything which high dynamic range would actually do. So this is really all I'm going to say about this feature. It's just a bit of a useless gimmick in my view. There's image setup next, but that is grayed out unless you're using VGA and analog connection. That's the same on all AOC monitors. It's just something which allows you to change various things like the clock and phase and various other things which only apply to analog connections and don't apply to digital connections. I think it does have a sharpness control in the image setup, not to tease you, but aside from that, with the digital connection, this monitor, as usual for AOC monitors, there's actually no sharpness adjustment. So the sharpness is actually completely good, it's neutral by default. Most users will be perfectly happy with it, but I know some people do like to change the sharpness, and that isn't something you can do manually on this monitor. Some of the preset modes, which I'll come across shortly, they do change the sharpness or add an additional sharpness filter, a bit like the HDR effect does, but you can't control that, and it's pretty heavy sharpness filter, so it looks a bit rubbish, to be honest. Next is color setup. You can change the color temp. Warm is the factory defaults. Normal, which is a cooler look to the image, it has a higher white point. Cool, which has a high white point again and looks very cool in terms of looking blue tinted. sRGB, and that's an sRGB emulation mode, and that's something which is explored in the written review. But I'll just quickly show you that it does actually lock the brightness, because that's something which people do like to know here. You can see the contrast and brightness is grayed out. You can't adjust that. You can't adjust the gamma mode either with the sRGB setting enabled, so that the brightness is moderately high. It's locked to 90, so be aware of that if you want to use the sRGB setting. And then there's user, and that allows you to manually adjust the red, green and blue color channels. There's DCB mode, dynamic color boost. This oversaturates various shades. Full enhance increases the saturation of all shades, and this is again a digital saturation enhancement, so it pulls things close to the edge of the gamut and you have a decrease in shade variety, so it's not really very attractive in my view at all. Nature Skin, that just targets really your red shades and your pink shades, that kind of thing, makes them more saturated. Green Field does the same with green shades. Sky Blue does the same with blue shades, so it just biases extra saturation towards various different shades. Auto Detect is supposed to look at the content and decide which saturation mode to use. It generally just goes for full enhance in my experience, or you can have that set to off. The DCB demo mode, that just does a split screen and shows you DCB active on one side and not active on the other. Next is Picture Boost. This allows you to activate the bright frame feature. So that puts a little frame, you can see it in the top right corner of the screen. You can see that there's a little frame there which is different contrast to the rest of the screen. It allows you to adjust the contrast and the brightness of that little frame independent of the rest of the screen. However, the brightness adjustment is just purely a digital brightness adjustment. It doesn't change the backlight brightness because that's all controlled as one unit, and you can't just have the brightness of the backlight controlled differently for one section of the screen. So it just allows you to configure the image differently for a specific section of the screen, and you can change the size of the frame. You can have it completely fill the screen if you want, and you can change the brightness, as I said, the digital brightness, so it just starts flooding the image if you have that above 50, and you can change the contrast. And the purpose of this really is so you can highlight a specific area of the image. For example, you might be giving a presentation and you want to highlight a particular diagram or something like that, or you're playing a game and you want the map to be a bit more visible compared to other aspects of the game, for example. Or if you want to make it full screen, you have a bit more control over the image than you can get with the other OSD settings, but I really wouldn't fuss too much about that because this monitor is very nicely configured and configurable elsewhere in the OSD. Next is OSD Setup. That allows you to change things like the language that the OSD is displayed in. There's timeout period, that's the idle timeout period, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD automatically disappears. And it's set to, it was set to 10 before actually when I was recording the rest of the video, and it kept on disappearing on me. So I've set that to 120 seconds, 2 minutes. DP capability, you can set that to 1.1 or 1.2. 1.1 is just for compatibility. If you have an older system which doesn't support 1.2, you'd lose some functionality of the monitor. For example, you wouldn't be able to use adaptive sync with 1.1. H position and V position, you can change the horizontal and vertical position of the OSD system on the screen. You can change the volume of the integrated speakers or anything connected to the 3.5mm jack. There's a transparency effect of the menu system itself, a transparency effect. You can increase that or decrease that to change how the menu appears. There's a break reminder feature. After the monitor's been on for an hour, it'll just display a message on the screen saying you might want to take a break. Then you just press one of the buttons and it gets rid of the message. So if you want to be reminded every hour to take a break, then feel free to have this enabled. Next, there are some more interesting settings. Game setting. These allow you to change the game mode of the monitor. I'm not going to spend too long going through these because, as usual, they're just presets that upset the image in various different ways. There's FPS, and that looks very bright. It looks heavily saturated, not in a good way because it also increases the digital saturation, so you lose that shade variety. You'd also notice, or should notice, that lots of things are grayed out. For example, you can't adjust the brightness, the contrast, gamma mode. So this is all controlled automatically. There's also a sharpness filter applied. It's over sharpened the image. So it just doesn't look nice at all in my view, and I don't see why, if you're playing an FPS game, you'd want it to look like crap compared to the rest of your content. Same with RTS, although that makes different adjustments. Things again look oversaturated, but in different ways. I think the greens are actually quite strongly saturated with this setting, the reds not so much. But again, it seems to have and it possibly doesn't have the same level of sharpness filter applied, but it just upsets the image. There's racing, which again oversaturates the image and just upsets the balance in general. And note that you can't manually adjust the colour channels in any of these settings either. The colour setup menu is completely greyed out as well. There are also 3 numbered gamer settings for game mode. Gamer 1, Gamer 2, Gamer 3. These do offer better flexibility. However, the colour setup menu remains greyed out. You can at least adjust the brightness and things like that in the luminance menu. So you've at least got that on your side. But unfortunately, I think really having the colour setup menu greyed out is annoying enough. But to add insult to injury, there's an extra sharpness filter applied to these numbered gamer modes as well. And it isn't just the fact that the colour setup is greyed out that's a problem, it's also that the colour temperature appears far too cool. It's really off what most people would want to use, and you can't do anything about that, I'm afraid. Gamer 2, that actually has a warmer colour temperature, so that's a bit better. Gamer 3 is a bit better again. So the changes between Gamer 1, Gamer 2 and Gamer 3 in terms of the colour setup, yeah, they're there. But you always get oversaturation and you can't do anything about that. So again, this is digital saturation enhancement, not something you need on this monitor or should want at all. So I just prefer to leave game mode off and manually tweak things myself. There's shadow control, and this is designed to lighten dark areas so that enemies are more visible, for example, in your games, in the shadowy areas of games. So if you increase this even one step up to 60, it completely floods the image. It doesn't just target the dark areas, it actually affects the black point, so you have a reduction in contrast. It also affects the gamma of the overall image, and it just messes things up. If you increase it further, you can see it gets a bit ridiculous. So this is quite a poorly implemented sort of black equalizer type of feature. It should be more targeted than it is. It doesn't really have very good utility in my opinion. If you decrease it further, then things just become very dark, as you can see, but you don't have any sort of increase in contrast because your black point stays exactly the same. Next, there's game color, and this allows you to adjust the digital saturation levels of the monitor, another way of doing that, but gives you finer control. So you can have that set to 10, which is a default. If you increase that, it increases the saturation by pulling shades close to the edge of the gamut. So by the time you've got to 20, things look like a weird cartoon. You've got no shade variety at all. Well, you obviously do have some shade variety, and you can see that green is different to red, but you lose the finer shade variety, and that is not attractive at all. And as I mentioned, the monitor does have a generous colour gamut. It doesn't need any help with saturation. So some users might even want to decrease this slightly, but that does upset the balance of the image. You will find that some shades become greatly undersaturated, whereas others appear still a bit more saturated than some users might like. So it's difficult to get the right balance here, but it does allow you to fine tune it according to your preferences if you like to do that kind of thing. I would just leave it on the neutral value of 10 for the best image. Low blue mode, low blue light settings, multimedia, internet, office and reading becoming subsequently stronger with each setting. These give you a warmer image, they decrease your blue colour channel and therefore decrease the blue light output. The reading mode is the most effective and it's explored in the written review. It's something I do use for my own viewing comfort in the evenings. Overdrive settings also explored in the review. Medium, strong, off and weak. I was just doing some testing before with the medium setting, but I actually prefer strong, as I mentioned in the review, for most refresh rates at least. FreeSync, you can enable or disable that. Frame counter, which displays the refresh rate of the display, and if you've got adaptive sync active and it's doing its thing, that will change according to the frame rate of the content as well. There's MBR, motion blur reduction, which is explored in the review. That's greyed out at the moment, and that's because you can't have FreeSync active or adaptive sync active at the same time as MBR. Can't use the two technologies at the same time. So now you can see that there's a little bar here. You can set that to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, blah, 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 all the way up to 20. This is the strobe backlight feature of the monitor. You'll be able to see the flickering clearly in the video. To your eye, it doesn't actually appear as such a violent strobing effect, but that is what it's doing. It is strobing the backlight. It's a strobe backlight technology designed to decrease motion blur. I don't like the setting that much, to be honest, and I explore it in the review and give my reasons why. I don't think it's the best implementation of a strobe backlight technology. It's not the worst either. It does give you a bit of flexibility, so that's good. You'll also notice that if you've got MBR active, because you don't have adaptive sync active at least, so you've got MBR accessible, I should say. There's another overdrive setting, boost. That sets MBR to 20, which is the highest value. It also will give you the dimmest image and potentially the best motion clarity. So that's set to 20, even though it doesn't show 20 there. And it sets the overdrive as if it was set to strong. So that's all the boost mode does. Next, there's extra. That has various other settings. So you can change the input used by the monitor. You can have it automatically select it for you, or you can manually select it if you prefer. Auto config, that is another thing which is just related to VGA analog connections, not applicable to digital connections. There's an off timer feature that allows you to set a time in hours after which the monitor will automatically turn off, or will put itself in a low power state at least. DDC/CI, it's part of the plug and play functionality of the monitor. It allows you to use software to control the OSD, for example AOC's G menu software, which I'm going to show you very shortly. And there's an option to reset everything to the factory defaults. Finally, there's a little bit of a section there towards the right side where it shows resolution, horizontal frequency, vertical frequency. The V frequency is of course the important one, but it just shows FreeSync if you've got adaptive sync active on the monitor. So it doesn't adjust dynamically according to the refresh rate in your variable refresh rate environment. But if you use the frame rate counter I showed you earlier, that will do that. So to finish off, I'm going to have a quick look at the AOC G menu software. This can be downloaded from a website, portrait.com, or you can just Google it or use your favourite search engine to search for AOC G menu and you'll be able to download it quite easily. The nice thing is you don't need a USB cable connected for this to use. It uses the DDC/CI channel of the monitor, as I mentioned before. And it does work well. It has various different functions and it's very clearly labelled on the screen. You can cycle the different game modes, for example. But there's the custom setting there, which is actually just having game mode disabled. But if you click advanced there, you can then manually configure various different options, such as the color channels, or you can set one of the color temperatures. There's the shadow control there, game color, various different options, and it's very easy to adjust different things, the brightness. And it'll do it in real time, so you can see your adjustments straight away. Something to be aware of though, as I mentioned before, the sRGB setting locks out some things, control of various things. Naturally, you can't adjust the red, green and blue color channels because that's something you can only do with the user RGB setting. However, it seems to show that you can adjust brightness and contrast, but you can't. As I showed you in the OSD system, that's grayed out. So this doesn't do anything at all. And if you press OK, it doesn't do anything either. So hopefully that'll be fixed in a later version of the software to at least display things grayed out when you can't activate them, but I wouldn't hold my breath for that, to be honest. And even more strangely, the gamma modes are still there, and if you activate one of them, it completely messes up the image. So the image is just completely wrong now. And if you want to correct that, you would need to go back to advanced, or you don't need to do this, you could actually just go into the menu system itself and just sort of cycle back into the sRGB setting. It'll correct it for you, or select one of the other color temperature settings and it's all fine. And if there are various different settings that you like to use, you can export and import them. So you might want different brightness levels to be used, for example, for different games or different times of the day. Then you could export this particular set of settings and import it later. But this is the only interface where you can actually select them. It just exports it as an XML file. Then you have to press import to import that XML file. So it's not really very intuitive, to be honest, and it's not an easy way in the sort of main G menu to select your different brightness settings or whatever customizations you've made. But it is what it is. Game Sync, that allows you to have different game modes tied to different applications. So there are various different applications here you might run. I don't find this very useful at all, and that's because the things you can select are the game modes. And as I've already mentioned elsewhere in the OSD video, they're pretty useless, except for the custom one. However, you can't have different sets of custom settings tied to different applications. There's an easy way to activate and change the low blue mode, so this works very well. Just cycle the different low blue mode settings. Very easy to do that. Eco modes, the same thing with eco modes, but note there was also a reading eco mode which made everything monochrome in the OSD. That's not actually displayed here. Not every single setting which is available in the OSD is actually available on the G menu software, just a lot of the key ones are. There's something quite interesting though. If you press extended eco features here, you'll see you can activate timers. Idle timer as they call it, so the screen will dim after a given amount of time. So if you know you're going to be sort of not using the monitor shortly, then it does that. It's not really as elegant as, for example, a light and activity sensor, which some models have, which would know when you're not using the monitor or you're not sitting by the monitor and then dim the screen or turn it off for you automatically. It's not that elegant, just sort of done by timers. And you can set the power off automatically after a certain time, as well as just dimming the screen. Power schedule as well. You can have the monitor turn off automatically at various different times of the day, so that could be quite useful, I guess. Finally, there's display, some extra settings there. Something I didn't mention before, in the main OSD system, for the extra menu, there is something which is grayed out there, image ratio. It was grayed out when I showed you before, and that's because it applies to non-native resolutions. It allows you to adjust the scaling behavior of the monitor, and you can see that on G menu here in the display section as well. So it has image select, it shows you the options there. There are various different options, 1:1 to 1:1 pixel mapping mode, 4:3, various different screen size emulation modes and aspect ratio emulation modes as well. If I change to one of the resolutions which supports scaling, so a non-native resolution, 720p if you like to call it that, 1280 by 720. You'll see that things don't look right. You see the image select is set to full, but it looks like it's doing 1:1 pixel mapping. You'll notice it says full HD there as well, 1920 by 1080. That doesn't match that. The reason for that is it's simply using GPU scaling. Select 60 Hz, it should hopefully fill the whole screen. Yep, and it lets you use the interpolation process of the monitor itself. So now I'll be able to show you what the image select options do. So there's full, which is equivalent to the wide setting in image ratio, and you can see there the resolution is correctly displayed now as 720p, if you like to call it that. You can see that it hasn't done the one-to-one, and the reason for that is that, and this is horribly, and I'm sorry that this is going a bit off topic for people who are just interested in the OSD itself, but I do like to show some of the extended functionality every now and then. And I believe that is probably because FreeSync is active, Adaptive Sync's active. Another thing I should mention, if you're running at 60 Hz as I am now, it slows the whole menu system down. It's actually quite laggy. So the menu system speed depends on the refresh rate you've got the display set to. So I'm just going to disable FreeSync and see what happens. Nothing. Well, that's curious. So I've reopened Gmenu up. I haven't got FreeSync active. I've got it at a resolution which is non-native, and I'm running at 60 Hz. And finally this seems to work. Hallelujah. So yes, if you've got various conditions met, you can indeed use this, and I'll show you some of the other options. I'm not going to go through them all, but if you wanted to simulate a 16:10 22-inch screen, you could do that. But because I'm using a 16:9 resolution at the moment with this one, the 720p one, things do look squashed up and weird, but this is just an emulation mode. So this would look more natural, 21:5-inch, 16:9. So you can see the screen space used is just like a 21.5-inch monitor, and there's a black border for the rest of it. The one-to-one pixel mapping mode, I know I didn't really mention this before, but the black border it gives there means that the image itself is just using 1280 by 720 pixels in this case. But even if you don't want to use this to mess around with the different image ratio settings, it is a quick way to just change the resolution and refresh rate. So a few final things. You can see you can change the input hotkeys. You can assign hotkeys to different functions, so you can change the mode, brightness, shadow control feature, or line out volume with various different button presses, and you can define that yourself. The brightness one is probably quite useful, brightness up and brightness down. For example, you might have control and up arrow for brightness up, control down arrow for brightness down. And now if I do that, I can very quickly adjust the brightness. And you don't need to have this active, you don't need to have this as your active application. It minimizes to the system tray when you're not using it, and you can see that my hotkeys still apply. It might not be clear on the video, but it's definitely adjusting the brightness. So that's really all there is to the Gmenu system, and indeed the OSD on-screen display menu system of the AOC 24G2 or 24G2U depending on your region. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.